My husband forgot our anniversary, so I checked his location. I wish I never did. Trust is a fragile thing, and mine shattered the moment I tapped that location icon on our anniversary. My name is Sophia, and I'm 32 years old. 5 years ago, I married the man I believed was my soulmate, Michael. We had what appeared to be the perfect marriage, a beautiful home in the suburbs, successful careers, and the kind of connection that made others envious. Our friends often commented on how we were still as in love as the day we met. But on our 5th anniversary, that illusion began to crumble. The morning had started with such promise. Michael woke me with gentle kisses and a cup of my favorite coffee, just the way I liked it. He wished me a happy anniversary before heading to the shower, and I spent the day anticipating the romantic evening we had planned. I had made reservations at the restaurant where he had proposed, and I could barely contain my excitement as I dressed in the new silk dress I had bought just for the occasion. But as the hours ticked by, Michael's calls became less frequent. When I called him at 6 p.m. to confirm our dinner plans, he sounded distracted and stressed. He explained that an emergency had come up at work, a major client crisis that required his immediate attention. I understood, of course. Michael was a dedicated architect, and his projects often demanded his time. Still, I couldn't hide my disappointment when he said he would have to cancel our dinner plans. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he had said, his voice smooth as honey. "I'll make it up to you this weekend. We'll go away somewhere special, just the two of us." I tried to be understanding. Really, I did. But as the evening wore on and my anniversary dinner for one grew cold, a familiar knot of doubt began to form in my stomach. This wasn't the first time Michael had canceled plans at the last minute due to a work emergency. Lately, it seemed to be happening more and more. He had been distant, preoccupied, and coming home later than usual. When I questioned him, he would become defensive or change the subject. At 10 p.m., I decided to call him again, but this time, his phone went straight to voicemail. My heart sank as I imagined him in some important meeting, too busy to even glance at his phone. Or worse, somewhere else entirely. The thought made me feel sick to my stomach. We had always been honest with each other, or so I believed. We even shared our location with each other through a phone app, something Michael had suggested when he went on a solo business trip 2 years ago. "It's just for peace of mind," he had said, "so you know I'm always safe." Now, as I sat alone in our perfectly decorated dining room, surrounded by photos of our happy life together, I made a decision that would change everything. I opened the location app on my phone, my fingers trembling slightly. I told myself I was just being silly, that I would see his little icon blinking at his office building, and I would feel guilty for ever doubting him. But that's not what I saw. Instead of the familiar downtown office building, Michael's location was at an address I didn't recognize in a residential area across town. My blood ran cold as I zoomed in on the map. It was a modest house on a quiet street, the kind of place you'd drive past without a second glance. What was he doing there? And why had he lied about being at work? I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a client's home, or perhaps he was helping a colleague with something. But as I checked the time, 10:47 p.m., these explanations seemed increasingly unlikely. No legitimate business meeting would take place this late at someone's home. My heart pounding, I grabbed my car keys from the counter. I didn't have a plan, really. I just knew I couldn't sit there any longer, torturing myself with unanswered questions. Whatever I was about to discover, I needed to see it with my own eyes. As I backed out of our driveway, I glanced at the house we had built together, the symbol of our perfect life, and wondered if anything about it was real anymore. The drive across town felt both endless and too short. Each red light was an eternity, giving my imagination time to conjure up scenarios that made my stomach twist into knots. Was he having an affair? The thought was so painful I could barely breathe. Michael and I had been through so much together. We had supported each other through career changes, family illnesses, and the ups and downs that come with building a life.
How could he throw it all away? When I finally turned onto the street where his phone was located, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I parked a few houses down, killing the engine and sitting in the darkness, trying to calm my racing heart. There it was, Michael's car, parked in the driveway of a small, unassuming bungalow with a neatly maintained garden. The lights were on inside, casting a warm glow onto the lawn. For a moment, I considered turning around and going home. Maybe it was better not to know. Maybe I could pretend I never checked his location, that I had simply fallen asleep waiting for him to come home. But as I sat there, paralyzed by indecision, I saw a shadow move past the living room window. It was unmistakably Michael's silhouette, tall and familiar, even in shadow. Something inside me hardened. Whatever was happening behind that door, I deserved to know the truth. Taking a deep breath, I opened the car door and stepped into the cool night air, my feet carrying me toward the house that held the secrets of my marriage. The house was smaller than it appeared from the street, with faded paint on the window frames and a slightly crooked welcome mat that seemed to mock me with its cheerful message. As I drew closer, I could hear muffled voices from inside. Michael's distinctive baritone, and another voice, higher and more delicate, that I didn't recognize. My first instinct was to burst in, to demand answers and expose whatever betrayal was happening within those walls. But something held me back, a combination of fear and a lingering hope that there might be a reasonable explanation for all of this. Instead, I found myself creeping along the side of the house, drawn toward the light spilling from a partially open window blind. Peering through the gap, my heart stopped. There was Michael, sitting on a worn floral sofa, his back to me. And across from him, in an armchair that looked like it had seen better decades, was an elderly woman with silver hair pinned in a loose bun. She was holding a teacup with delicate, trembling hands, and though I couldn't see her face clearly, there was something familiar about her posture, something that tugged at a memory I couldn't quite place. They weren't in a passionate embrace or sharing an intimate dinner. They were just talking, the elderly woman gesturing occasionally with her free hand while Michael listened intently. On the coffee table between them sat a photo album, open to what appeared to be old photographs. The scene was domestic, almost mundane, which somehow made it more confusing and painful than any affair I had imagined. I continued to watch, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was this woman? Why had Michael never mentioned her? And why lie about being at work to visit her? As I stood there, hidden in the shadows of someone else's life, I noticed something on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, a collection of framed photographs. One in particular caught my eye, a picture of a much younger Michael, perhaps no older than 10, standing beside the same woman, her arm wrapped protectively around his shoulders. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This woman wasn't his lover. She was his mother. But that was impossible. Michael had told me his mother died when he was in college, a tragic story of a sudden heart attack that had left him devastated. He had shared this with me early in our relationship, tears in his eyes as he described how he had found her, how he wished he had said goodbye properly. Why would my parents go to such lengths to hide Grace's true origins? What were they so afraid of? And most importantly, how would Grace react when she eventually learned the truth? I decided to approach my mother's side of the family, hoping that someone might have information about her friendship with Jennifer Thompson. My grandmother, my mom's mother, had always been a repository of family stories and gossip. I arranged to visit her under the pretense of helping her with some gardening, but my real intention was to probe for information about the past. As we worked in our garden, pruning roses and pulling weeds, I casually mentioned my mom's college days, asking about her friends and roommates. My grandmother's hands paused in their work, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She confirmed that my mom had indeed been close friends with Jennifer Thompson, describing them as inseparable during their college years. They had dreamed of raising their children together, of being aunts to each other's kids. But after college, they had drifted apart, as friends often do when life takes them in different directions. What caught my attention was my grandmother's hesitation when I asked if they had stayed in touch. She mentioned that my mom had attended Jennifer's funeral, but there was something she wasn't telling me, a shadow that crossed her face when she spoke of it. I pressed gently, asking if there had been any contact between our families after the funeral. My grandmother sighed, putting down her gardening tools and motioning for me to sit with her on the bench. What she told me next would change everything. According to my grandmother, my mom had initially planned to adopt Grace officially, to raise her as her own while honoring the memory of her best friend. But there had been complications, legal issues, family objections from Jennifer's side, and most surprisingly, resistance from my father. He had been hesitant to take on the responsibility of raising another child, especially one that came with such a tragic backstory. There had been arguments, tensions that had rippled through our extended family. In the end, they had reached a compromise. They would raise Grace as their own, but they would do it quietly, without the formal adoption process that would have left a paper trail. They would change her name, create a new backstory, and integrate her into our family as if she had always been there. It was a decision that had caused a rift between my mom and some of her family members, including my grandmother, who thought they were making a terrible mistake. As I sat there, listening to my grandmother's story, I felt a mix of emotions: anger at my father for his initial reluctance, confusion about my mother's decision to go along with such a deception, and a growing sense of sympathy for Grace, caught in the middle of a family drama she knew nothing about. But there was still something missing, a piece of the puzzle that would explain why they had maintained this lie for so long, why they had begged me not to tell Grace the truth. My grandmother must have sensed my confusion because she took my hand and looked me straight in the eye. She told me that there was more to the story, something that my parents had never shared with anyone outside their immediate circle, something that might explain their desperation to keep Grace's true identity a secret. But she wouldn't tell me what it was, saying that it wasn't her place to reveal such a significant family secret. She urged me to talk to my parents, to demand the full truth before making any decisions about what to do with the information I had gathered. As I drove home that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the road, I knew that I was at a crossroads. I had uncovered enough information to understand the basic shape of the deception, but there was still a missing piece, a crucial element that would explain everything. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I couldn't rest until I found it. The truth about Grace's adoption was more complex and more painful than I had imagined, and I had a feeling that the final piece of the puzzle would be the most shocking of all. The confrontation with my parents was inevitable.
Extending a hand toward me. "It's so lovely to finally meet you, dear. Michael has kept you quite the secret." I ignored her hand, my eyes fixed on Michael. "Kept me a secret? Or kept her a secret?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. "Which is it, Michael? Because one of these things is true, and I'm starting to think very little else has been." The look on Michael's face was one of utter defeat. He glanced from his mother to me, trapped between two worlds that had suddenly collided. In that moment, I saw not just a man caught in a lie, but someone carrying a burden far heavier than I had imagined. "Can we talk about this inside?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please?" As I stepped into the modest living room, the air thick with unspoken secrets, I had no idea that the truth I was about to uncover would be far more complicated and heartbreaking than any affair I had imagined. The man I thought I knew, the life we had built together, it was all about to be re-examined in the harsh light of reality, and I wasn't sure our marriage would survive the scrutiny. The living room was small but tidy, filled with an eclectic mix of furniture that spanned decades. The floral sofa where Michael had been sitting, the worn armchair that Eleanor now reclaimed, a dark wood bookshelf overflowing with books and trinkets. Everything spoke of a life lived simply but with care. On the walls hung photographs in various frames, some black and white, others faded with age, all capturing moments of a family history I knew nothing about. Eleanor bustled around, offering me tea and fussing over me as if I were a long-lost daughter rather than the woman who had just discovered her husband's monumental lie. "Please, sit down, dear. You look like you've seen a ghost. Michael, get Sophia something to drink. She's in shock." Michael moved mechanically to the small kitchen, returning with a glass of water that he placed in front of me on a coaster shaped like a lighthouse. I didn't touch it. I couldn't take my eyes off him, trying to reconcile the man I had married with this stranger who had kept his own mother's existence a secret for 5 years. "Would someone please explain what's going on?" I finally asked, my voice tight with emotion.
Michael, you told me your mother was dead. I've comforted you on the anniversary of her supposed death. We visited what you told me was her grave. And all this time, she's been here, alive?" Eleanor looked from me to her son, her expression confused. "Dead? Michael, what has she been told? Why would you say such a thing?" Michael sank onto the sofa, his head in his hands. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the silence in the room was heavy with unanswered questions. I could see the conflict in his posture, the weight of years of deception pressing down on him. "It's complicated," he finally said, looking up at me with eyes filled with pain. "There's so much you don't know about my family, about our history. I wanted to protect you from it." "Protect me?" I repeated, incredulously. "By lying to me? By pretending your mother was dead? How is that protection, Michael?" He sighed, running his hands through his hair again. "Can we start from the beginning? Please, just give me a chance to explain everything." As I sat there, in the home of the mother-in-law I never knew I had, I agreed to listen. I had no idea that Michael's story would reveal not just a lie about his mother's death, but a complex web of family secrets, shame, and love that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the man I had married. The truth, when it began to unfold, was far more complicated than I could have imagined. Michael's story wasn't just a simple lie. It was about a lifetime of carefully constructed narratives designed to hide a past he was ashamed of. And as he spoke, I realized that our perfect marriage had been built on a foundation of secrets, each one more painful than the last. Michael began his story slowly, hesitantly, as if testing the waters of my reaction. He explained that his mother, Eleanor, hadn't just been alive all these years. She had been struggling with early-onset Alzheimer's disease for the past decade. The condition had progressed gradually at first, then more rapidly in recent years, leaving her with good days and bad, moments of clarity followed by periods of confusion. "She was diagnosed when I was in my early 20s, Michael explained, his voice low and heavy with emotion. "The doctors said it was genetic, a rare form that affects people earlier than typical Alzheimer's. At first it was small things, forgetting names, misplacing items, but it got worse." I listened, trying to process this information. It explained the slightly confused look I had noticed in Eleanor's eyes, the way she had seemed to recognize me but couldn't quite place how she knew me. "But why lie about it?" I asked, my voice softer now, the anger replaced by confusion. "Why tell me she was dead?" Michael looked at his mother, who was watching us with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Because of the stigma," he said finally. "Because of how my father left. Because I was ashamed." He went on to explain that his father had abandoned the family shortly after Eleanor's diagnosis, unable to cope with the prospect of caring for a wife with a degenerative disease. Michael, then just starting college, had been left to manage his mother's care alone, juggling his studies with visits to nursing homes and doctor's appointments. "I didn't want people's pity," he continued, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond me. "I didn't want to be the guy with the tragic family story. When I met you, everything was going so well. You were perfect, our relationship was perfect, and I didn't want to complicate it with my baggage." "So you just erased her from your life story?" I asked, incredulous. "You told me she was dead, and that was easier than the truth?" "At the time, yes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was a lie that got away from me. The longer we were together, the harder it became to tell the truth. How do you explain to the woman you love that you've been lying about something so fundamental for years? How do you admit that the foundation of your relationship is built on a lie?" As he spoke, I could see the pain etched on his face, the weight of years of deception. Part of me wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but another part of me was still reeling from the betrayal. This wasn't just a small lie or a moment of weakness. This was a systematic deception that had colored our entire relationship. "Is that why you were here tonight?" I asked, glancing at Eleanor, who was now quietly sipping her tea, seemingly lost in her own world.
Because it's our anniversary, and you chose to spend it with her instead of me? Michael's face softened with concern as he looked at his mother. Her caregiver called me this afternoon. Mom had a fall yesterday, and they were worried about her. I needed to come check on her, make sure she was okay. I was going to call you from here, explain everything, but... He trailed off, shaking his head. There's no good excuse for lying to you, Sophia. I know that. As I sat there, absorbing his explanation, I couldn't help but think back to all the times Michael had been working late or called away on business emergencies. How many of those had been visits to his mother? How many lies had he told to cover up the truth? The anniversary dinner, I said suddenly, remembering the reservation I had made weeks ago. Did you forget, or did you never intend to come? Michael looked horrified. No, of course not. I would never forget our anniversary. I was looking forward to it all week.
But when I got the call about Mom, I panicked. I didn't know how to explain where I was going, so I used the easiest excuse, work. The room fell silent as we both processed the implications of his confession. Our marriage, once so straightforward and honest, now seemed riddled with complications and half-truths. I looked at Eleanor, who was now humming softly to herself, apparently unaware of the tension in the room. She seemed harmless, frail, nothing like the burden Michael had made her out to be. Does she know? I asked quietly. Does your mother know you've been telling people she's dead? Michael shook his head. She doesn't remember much from day to day. Sometimes she thinks I'm still in college. Other times she asks when my father is coming home. It's easier this way, for everyone. But was it easier, I wondered? Looking at the three of us, Michael, his mother, and me, trapped in this web of deception, it seemed to me that the truth, however painful, would have been simpler than this complicated lie we were all living. As the night wore on, more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Michael explained how he had arranged for Eleanor's care, setting up a trust fund to pay for her caregivers and medical expenses. He visited her several times a week, always making sure to come on days when her mind was clearer. He had even arranged for her to move into this smaller, more manageable home when her disease had progressed to the point where she couldn't live alone anymore. I wanted to bring you into this part of my life so many times, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But how do you introduce your wife to a mother who might not remember her name the next day? How do you explain the shame of a father who couldn't handle the pressure and ran away? I listened, my heart aching for the young man who had shouldered this burden alone, for the woman in front of me who was slowly losing her connection to the world, and for myself, the wife who had been kept in the dark about a fundamental part of her husband's life. As the grandfather clock in the corner struck midnight, signaling the end of our anniversary, I realized that our marriage would never be the same. The question was whether it could survive this revelation, whether trust could be rebuilt after such a significant betrayal. The drive home was silent, Michael occasionally glancing at me as if waiting for me to speak, to react, to do something. But I had nothing to say. My mind was reeling from the evening's revelations, trying to process the truth about Michael's family and the extent of his deception. When we arrived back at our house, the home we had filled with so many happy memories that now seemed tainted, I went straight to the study, needing space to think. Michael followed me, standing in the doorway as I paced the room, my thoughts racing. Say something, he finally pleaded. Yell at me, cry, anything. I can't stand this silence. I stopped pacing and turned to face him. What do you want me to say, Michael? That I understand? That it's okay that you lied to me for 5 years about something so fundamental? That it's fine that you let me comfort you on the anniversary of a death that never happened? He flinched at my words, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I know I can't expect forgiveness right away, but please try to understand why I did it. I'm trying, I said, my voice softer now. But every time I think I understand, I remember another lie. Another deception. How do I know what's real and what's not anymore? How do I trust anything you've told me about your past, about yourself? This question hung between us, heavy and unanswerable. Michael had built our relationship on a foundation of half-truths and omissions, and now that foundation had cracked, threatening to bring everything down with it. "I've never lied about how I feel about you," he said, his voice earnest. "That's the one thing that's always been real. My love for you, my commitment to our marriage, that's not a lie, Sophia." I wanted to believe him, I really did. But as I looked at the man I had married, the man whose entire family history I had just learned was partially fabricated, I couldn't help but wonder what else he had hidden from me. What other secrets was he keeping? The days that followed were some of the most difficult of our marriage. We moved through the house like strangers, occupying the same space but living in different worlds. Michael tried to give me space, but his presence was a constant reminder of the betrayal. Every time I looked at him, I saw not just my husband, but a stranger whose past I didn't really know. I found myself replaying our entire relationship, searching for clues I had missed. The times he had changed the subject when family came up. The way he had steered conversations away from his childhood. The vague answers he had given when I asked about his parents' marriage. All these things now seemed like obvious red flags that I had blindly ignored. On the third day after the revelation, I was cleaning out a closet when I came across a box of Michael's old things from before we met. As I sifted through the contents, old photographs, yearbooks, letters, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a photograph of Michael with a woman I didn't recognize, his arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling at the camera. On the back, in Michael's handwriting, was a date from just a year before we met, along with the words, "With love, always." My hands trembled as I examined the photograph. Was this another secret, another part of his past he had hidden from me? As I continued to dig through the box, I found more photographs of them together, evidence of a relationship he had never mentioned. When Michael came home that evening, I was waiting for him in the living room, the photographs spread out on the coffee table between us. He stopped in his tracks when he saw them, his face paling as he realized what I had discovered. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice cold and steady. Michael sank onto the sofa, his eyes fixed on the photographs. "Her name is Jennifer," he said quietly. "We were together for about 2 years, right before I met you." I waited for more of an explanation, my heart pounding in my chest. When none came, I prompted him. "And why didn't I know about her? Was she another part of your life you decided to erase?" He shook his head, picking up one of the photographs and studying it, as if seeing it for the first time. "It's not like that, Sophia. Jennifer and it was complicated. She couldn't handle my mother's situation, the demands it placed on my time, my attention, my finances. We broke up because she wanted a life that I couldn't give her, one without the responsibility of a sick parent." As he spoke, I could hear the pain in his voice, the echo of a past heartbreak I had known nothing about. When I met you, I was still healing from that relationship. I didn't want to bring that baggage into something new, something that felt so right. So I kept it to myself, thinking it was in the past and didn't matter anymore. "But it does matter," I insisted, my frustration mounting. "Everything matters when it comes to building a life together. How can we have an honest future when you're hiding so much of your past?" He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and desperation. "I know I've made mistakes, Sophia, huge ones, but none of them were because I don't love you or because I don't want this marriage to work. I was trying to protect us from the pain, the complications, the judgments of others. I went about it all wrong, I see that now, but my intentions were good. I wanted to believe him, to see past the lies to the man I had fallen in love with. But each new revelation felt like another crack in the foundation of our marriage, and I wasn't sure how many more it could withstand before it collapsed completely. As the days turned into a week, I found myself grappling with conflicting emotions. Part of me was angry and hurt, feeling betrayed by the man I had trusted completely. But another part of me could understand, to some extent, why Michael had made the choices he had. The shame he felt about his family situation, the fear of being judged or pitied, these were human emotions, even if his response to them had been deeply flawed. What troubled me most was the pattern of deception. It wasn't just one lie, but a series of them, each building on the last until our entire relationship was constructed on a foundation of half-truths and omissions. How could we move forward when so much of our past was built on lies? On the 8th day after our anniversary, Michael came home with a box of old journals and photo albums.
"I want you to know everything," he said, placing the box on the coffee table. "No more secrets, no more omissions. If we're going to have any chance of moving past this, you need to know the real me, not the version I created to make myself more palatable." As I sat there, surrounded by the tangible evidence of a life I had known nothing about, I realized that our marriage was at a crossroads. I could either walk away, citing the breach of trust as too great to overcome, or I could stay and try to rebuild on a foundation of complete honesty. What I chose would depend not just on Michael's willingness to be completely transparent going forward, but on my ability to forgive the deception and see the man I had fallen in love with beneath the layers of lies he had constructed around himself. The following weeks were a journey into Michael's past, a painful but necessary exploration of the life he had kept hidden from me. We sat together for hours as he shared his journals, his photographs, his memories. He told me about his father's abandonment, his struggles to care for his mother while attending college, the heartbreak of his relationship with Jennifer when she couldn't accept the demands of his situation. With each revelation, I felt like I was getting to know a stranger, peeling back layers of deception to reach the core of the man I had married. It was both fascinating and heartbreaking to see how his experiences had shaped him, how the shame and fear had led him to construct a false narrative of his life. One evening, as we were looking through old photographs, Michael came across a picture of him as a teenager with his parents. In the photo, his father had his arm around his mother, both of them smiling at the camera, the picture of a happy family. "This was taken about a year before my mother's diagnosis," Michael said quietly, tracing the outline of his father's face with his finger. "He was a good man then, or so I thought. But when things got difficult, when my mother needed him most, he couldn't handle it. He left without even saying goodbye, just a note on the kitchen table saying he couldn't watch her fade away." I could hear the pain in his voice, the decades-old hurt still raw. I think that's when I started hiding things. I was so ashamed that he had abandoned us, so angry that he couldn't face the challenges like a real man should. I didn't want anyone to know that my father was a coward who ran away from his responsibilities. As he spoke, I began to understand the source of his shame, the root of the deception that had colored our entire relationship. It wasn't just about his mother's illness. It was about his father's abandonment, the stigma of a broken family, the fear of being judged for something that wasn't his fault, but that he had internalized as a reflection on his character. "My mother never really recovered from his leaving," Michael continued, his eyes distant with memory. "Even before the Alzheimer's, there was a part of her that was broken. She would sometimes stare at his empty chair at the dinner table, as if expecting him to walk through the door any moment. I think in some ways the disease was a mercy, allowing her to forget the pain of his abandonment. Looking at the photograph, at the happy family that had once been, I felt a surge of compassion for the teenage boy who had shouldered such a burden, who had watched his family disintegrate and had been left to pick up the pieces alone. It didn't excuse the lies he had told me, but it helped me understand the man behind the deception. "Did you ever try to find him?" I asked gently. "Your father, I mean." Michael shook his head, placing the photograph back in the album. "No, I was too angry, too hurt. Part of me hoped he was suffering somewhere, regretting his decision to leave us. But another part of me never wanted to see him again, never wanted to give him the chance to explain or apologize." As he closed the album, I could see the conflict in his eyes, the mixture of anger and longing that still defined his relationship with the father who had abandoned him. It was a wound that had never properly healed, one that had influenced so many of his decisions, including the decision to hide his past from me. In the weeks that followed, Michael and I continued this difficult journey into his past. He took me to meet his mother's caregivers, introduced me to the doctors who had been treating her for years, shared the financial records that showed how he had been supporting her all this time. With each step toward transparency, I felt a small measure of trust being restored, though I knew it would take time to rebuild what had been broken. What surprised me most during this period was Eleanor's reaction to me. On her good days, she was warm and welcoming, treating me like the daughter she never had. On her bad days, she was confused, sometimes mistaking me for Michael's previous girlfriend or asking when her husband was coming home.
Through it all, Michael was patient and loving, a stark contrast to the image of the distant son he had portrayed when he had told me his mother was dead. One afternoon, as we were visiting Eleanor, she had a moment of clarity that took us both by surprise. "You know," she said, looking directly at Michael, "I always worried about you, carrying all this responsibility alone. You never let anyone in, never let anyone help you with this burden." She turned to me, her eyes surprisingly lucid. "He's a good man, but he's been carrying shame that was never his to carry. His father's abandonment, my illness, these things don't define him, but he's let them shape his life in ways that have isolated him." As she spoke, Michael's eyes filled with tears, and I realized how much he needed to hear these words, not just from his mother, but from me as well. He had been so determined to protect me from his past that he had ended up creating a barrier between us, one that had nearly destroyed our marriage. After that visit, as we drove home in comfortable silence, I felt a shift in our relationship. The anger and hurt I had been carrying were beginning to be replaced by understanding and compassion. Michael's deception was still wrong, but I was starting to see it not as a betrayal of our love, but as a misguided attempt to protect it. "I've been thinking," I said as we pulled into our driveway, "about your mother."
About your past. I'd like to be more involved if you'll let me. I want to know her, to be part of this part of your life." Michael looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Are you sure? After everything I've put you through?" I nodded, reaching across the console to take his hand. "We can't change the past, Michael, but we can decide how to move forward. And I want to move forward together, with complete honesty, no matter how difficult the truth might be." As we sat there, hands clasped, I felt the first genuine sense of hope I had experienced since that fateful anniversary night. Our marriage wasn't fixed, not by a long shot, but we had taken a significant step toward healing the breach of trust that had threatened to destroy us. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult conversations and moments of doubt. But as I looked at the man I had married, the man with a complicated past and a flawed but loving heart, I knew that our love was worth fighting for, worth rebuilding on a foundation of complete honesty, no matter how painful the truth might be. 6 months after our anniversary, Michael and I stood in a small chapel, renewing our vows. It hadn't been my idea initially. I had been skeptical of the symbolism, worried that it would feel like a hollow gesture after everything we had been through. But Michael had insisted, wanting to mark our commitment to a new beginning, a marriage built on truth rather than deception. Eleanor sat in the front row, her expression one of serene happiness. On a good day, she understood the significance of the moment, her eyes filled with tears of joy as she watched her son reaffirm his commitment to the woman he loved. On a bad day, she might have been confused about who we were or why we were there, but she would have felt the love in the room, the genuine connection between two people who had weathered a storm and emerged stronger on the other side. As I stood there looking into Michael's eyes, I thought back to that night when I had checked his location, when my world had been turned upside down by a simple tap on a phone screen. I had thought that discovering his secret would be the end of our marriage, but in reality, it had been the beginning of something deeper, more honest, and ultimately more real than what we had before. "I promise to always be honest with you, even when the truth is difficult," Michael said. "I promise to share my whole life with you, not just the parts I'm proud of. I promise to trust you with my vulnerabilities, my fears, and my past." When it was my turn, I took a deep breath, my heart full of emotions that were too complex to put into words. "I promise to accept all of you, not just the version you present to the world. I promise to love you through the difficult moments, to forgive when forgiveness is hard, and to always seek understanding before judgment. I promise to build our future on a foundation of complete honesty, no matter how challenging that might be." As we exchanged rings, new ones that symbolized our renewed commitment, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent for months. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. There had been tears, arguments, moments when I wasn't sure we would make it. But we had persevered, guided by a love that was stronger than the deception that had threatened to destroy it.
In the months following our vow renewal, our relationship continued to evolve. Michael became more open, not just with me, but with others, gradually letting go of the shame that had driven him to hide his past. He even reached out to his father, not to reconcile, but to express the hurt and anger he had carried for so many years. The conversation was difficult and ultimately unsatisfying, but it provided a closure that Michael had needed for decades. For my part, I learned to balance forgiveness with healthy boundaries. I understood Michael's motivations for lying, but I also made it clear that deception would never be acceptable in our relationship again. We established new patterns of communication, creating a space where difficult truths could be shared without fear of judgment or rejection. Our visits with Eleanor became a regular part of our routine, sometimes just the two of us, other times with Michael joining us after work. On her good days, she would share stories from Michael's childhood, filling in gaps in the narrative he had constructed for himself. On her bad days, we would simply sit with her, holding her hand, offering comfort in the face of her confusion and fear. One afternoon, as we were leaving Eleanor's house, Michael took my hand, stopping me on the sidewalk. "I never properly thanked you," he said, his eyes serious, "for everything, for giving me a second chance, for loving my mother, for seeing past the lies to the man underneath." I squeezed his hand, a small smile playing on my lips. "That's what love is, Michael. It's not about perfection. It's about seeing someone's flaws and choosing to love them anyway. It's about building something real from the pieces, even when some of those pieces are broken." As we walked to the car, hand in hand, I thought about how far we had come since that night when I had checked his location, when a simple act of curiosity had unraveled the carefully constructed narrative of our marriage. What I had thought would be the end of our relationship had turned out to be the beginning of something deeper, more authentic, and ultimately more meaningful. The truth, I had learned, wasn't always comfortable or easy. It could be painful, messy, and complicated. But it was also the foundation on which real love could be built. Not the fairy tale version of love that exists in storybooks, but the resilient, forgiving, and enduring love that survives the storms of life and emerges stronger on the other side. As we drove home, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the horizon, I felt a sense of gratitude for the difficult journey we had undertaken. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it was real, built on a foundation of honesty that had been hard-won, but was unshakable. And in that imperfection, in that reality, I had found a love worth fighting for, a partnership worth rebuilding, and a future worth looking forward to, together.